Elected to Congress in 2012, U.S. Representative Thomas Massie serves the 4th Congressional District that stretches across northern Kentucky. I caught up with the congressman at General Butler State Park to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure package that's before the House, his position on COVID-19 vaccinations and coronavirus relief packages, and food supply issues. That's now on Congressional Update. Congressman Thomas Massie, thank you for inviting us to be here at the General Butler State Park. Beautiful scene and aesthetic we've got going on, so thank you.
This is the lovely 4th District of Kentucky, Renee, and you're always welcome here.
Well, it is certainly beautiful, a little serenity for the times, and we certainly could stand that. I thank you for making the time because we know that you all are preparing to go back to Washington sooner than you had planned. The August recess is being cut short so you can deal with infrastructure and God knows what else might be coming up. So let's just start there with the infrastructure package that the U.S. Senate passed. McConnell, the minority leader, did support that measure. Rand Paul did not. What are your thoughts about this measure? Will you vote for it?
Well, I'd like to be able to vote for it because I'm on the infrastructure committee. And so the House, in our House Infrastructure Committee, we marked up a similar bill which was much more ambitious. It would have spent more money, and the Senate sort of pared that back. And the anticipation now is not that you would take the Senate bill and the House bill and merge them in conference, but that the House will now accept the Senate terms. I am likely not to vote for that bill. I support infrastructure, obviously, but only about $110 billion of this $1 trillion plus bill is actually going to roads and bridges. And that's the problem that I have with it, some of the things that are in it. And it's also looking like in the House that Speaker Pelosi is going to try and couple the transportation and infrastructure bill with a much broader budget deal, the reconciliation deal that would spend upwards of $3 trillion. So we might not get a chance to vote on them separately, but even if we did, I'm probably a no on this infrastructure bill for all the extraneous spending.
Is there anything that would change your mind, and is there an opportunity for amendments to the bill?
I don't think they're going to let us have amendments. They're flying us back or driving us back, and we're going to vote on what you see is what you get. If we were to modify this bill at all, they'd have to vote on it again in the Senate. So it's sort of a take it or leave it bill. And our committee won't get a chance to have any amendments, and there won't be a chance to have them on the floor, I'm afraid.
So if you vote against it, and we know a lot about the Brent Spence Bridge, how do your constituents feel about the fact that you could be voting against a measure that could have a direct impact, particularly on their transportation in this very critical area of all this commerce that comes through the Brent Spence Bridge, what it means to the overall nation's economy? How do you reconcile that?
Well, you know, Kentucky's 4th District has 3 locks and dams. We've got about 20 bridges that go from Kentucky into other states from our congressional district. We've got the CVG airport, which is critical. By the way, not all of that's in this infrastructure bill. There are separate bills that fund those that I have voted for in the past, and I have voted for infrastructure bills in the past. So I think my constituents understand my reasons for voting against it. There's always the danger that somebody gets upset with you. But if I may point out some of the things that in this bill that I don't think should be in an infrastructure bill, there's a requirement to have high-speed internet for prison inmates, for instance. There's over $15 billion for an electric car infrastructure, publicly funded infrastructure plan. I drive an electric car. I would love to see more infrastructure for electric cars. The problem is when the government does it at the rest stops, it disincentivizes what's already happening, which is private investment of charging stations at privately owned gas stations. And you know, I'll actually be driving my electric car to DC and using privately funded infrastructure. I'm just afraid if the government gets involved, they will actually have a negative effect on the electric car infrastructure. Also, for the 4th District, we kind of lose in this deal because there's a lot of money in here for mass transit. There's as much money for mass transit as there is for roads and bridges in this bill. not very much of that's going to find its way to Kentucky's 4th District.
So if the bill were not tethered to the reconciliation bill, would you find any reason to support it on its own, singularly?
Absolutely. I mean, when I got to Congress, I begged them to put me on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee because I believe, number one, there's a federal nexus for it, and number two, we can find ways to pay for it. It's mostly funded with user fees. The people that use the infrastructure pay for it. If I got to vote on $110 billion of money for roads and bridges, I could be a yes on that for sure.
Right.
But that's not what's going to be presented to me. So many things are together in this bill. One of my complaints since I've been in Congress is that they put so many things together, and I think we'd be a lot better off if we had one vote on one topic.
You may not get as far. Maybe some people are concerned about that's a way to advance a lot of measures at once and to twist some arms creatively, but yours is unbendable in that regard, right?
Well, you know, the prevailing wisdom in D.C. is if the bigger the bill is, there are more reasons there are to vote for it. That there's something for everybody in it. And, you know, they'll almost dare you to vote against it. You know, the omnibus bill, I always point out, almost always has a pay raise for soldiers in it. And they will use that against you because you voted against something else in the bill.
Right.
But for me, the more things they add to a bill, a lot of times that just becomes more reasons to vote against the bill,
Right.
unfortunately, if we can't afford it.
Pivoting to COVID and to talk about some measures that you did not support and one that you tried to creatively hold up the vote on, and that was the CARES package, as we often hear, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. As you well know, this was something that you had a lot of backlash for and trying to force members to go on record. Even the president at the time, Donald Trump, called you a third-rate grandstander.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
That's why I'm here.
Thanks for reminding me,
That's why
Renee.
I'm here. So I do want to ask you if you have any misgivings about your actions on that and about how that turned out, and what did you gain from that? What were you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so just to recap, we've spent $5.2 trillion deficit spending. We've either printed it or borrowed it in the last 18 months. That's $40,000 of debt for every household. The first big bill was March 27th of 2020. I will never forget that date. I call it the singularity. I had Donald Trump calling me a third-rate grandstander. I had Nancy Pelosi calling me a dangerous nuisance. I had John Kerry calling me something we can't say on KET. And I had Liz Cheney max donating to my primary opponent, all in one day. CNN called me the most hated man in Washington, D.C., and I have to concede they might have gotten the news right that day because I was very hated, but what I was there to accomplish was not to delay the bill or to stop the bill. I thought we should vote on it. I thought we should have a recorded vote, and the Constitution requires that you show up for work. What I told my colleagues who were upset with me is that you've asked farmers to go to work, nurses to go to work, the grocery store baggers, you've asked them to bring it out to your car so you don't have to walk in the grocery store. And you're here telling the nation that it's too dangerous for you to show up for work. I think that's hypocritical. So what did we accomplish from that other than upsetting everybody in Washington, D.C., which I think in and of itself is an accomplishment some days? I believe by making them come to work, they were reluctant to do the next $2 trillion bill as quickly. They knew they would have to reconvene, and many of them did not want to come to work. So I used the fact that they didn't want to come to work, forcing them to come to work to spend money, I think actually resulted in them spending less money as soon as they would have otherwise.
Right. Well, I've heard you in other interviews talk about how much these stimulus packages have cost us in terms of our debt capacity or overload. We've incurred $5.2 trillion in debt that is connected to coronavirus relief. That's $40,000 every household, I've heard you say. Added 25% to the national debt over the last 18 months. But if you think about it, we're not borrowing that money from China, we're borrowing that from ourselves. So can that be considered the debt as we often refer to it?
As my favorite senator, Rand Paul, says, You can't take water out of the deep end of the pool and put it in the shallow end of the pool and make the pool deeper on the shallow end. It's kind of a circular thing, and what we're going to get out of it is inflation, and we're already seeing that. Also, almost worse than spending money we don't have or have to get a future promise to pay back at some point later, is the fact that the policies have encouraged people not to go to work. Now, there have been legitimate shutdowns and slowdowns because people have gotten ill from COVID. They had to stay home, and they should have stayed home when they were sick or when there were, too many cases in their workplace. But we've adopted this policy where we're paying people not to work, not just the people who need it, but people who don't need it. And so what we're also starting to see, instead of just inflation, is supply shortages. We've seen it in the grocery stores. We've had breakdowns in the food supply chain during COVID. I don't know the particular reason, but I just drove by the Motor Speedway here in my district and saw thousands of Ford trucks there that are lacking a computer chip, presumably. That's probably, since we don't make computer chips, that's probably a slowdown in another country. I don't know what the problem was there. But we're starting to see more of this in the supply lines. And I've had small business owners, regardless of political stripe, whether they're restaurant owners or home builders, they're begging me to change the policies that keep people at home, to change the policies that keep them from coming to work.
I want to go back to Speaker Pelosi for just a minute. When you go back to Washington on that Monday, and we'll be in, we do know that there is a mask mandate that she has reinstituted that was let up on in June, but considering the new CDC guidelines, she's reinstituted that. We know that your history with that you have declined to do that, and you were fined $500, and you tried to file suit in order to have that overturned and appealed, and that did not work. When you return to Washington, D.C., will you wear a mask as required on the House chamber by Speaker Nancy Pelosi?
I will not be wearing a mask in Washington, D.C. So my appeal in front of the Ethics Committee in Congress was not successful, but the lawsuit so far is going pretty well. I've got two other congressmen, three altogether, who've joined me in this lawsuit. We filed in federal court. We drew a Bush appointee as the judge. But whether we win or lose, I'm sure Pelosi will appeal the lawsuit, or the sergeant at arms, or whoever they name as the legitimate defendant in this case. And then it'll go from district to circuit court, and then we'll take it to the Supreme Court if we have to. Because what we believe that she is doing, one of the strongest planks in our lawsuit, is that she is using our salaries to change our activity, to modulate our speech. The mask fine doesn't apply if you're not in front of a camera. As soon as we walk out of the chamber, nobody gets fined for wearing a mask. So we've said it's a violation of the First Amendment because it's compelled speech to put the mask on in front of a camera, but she's also, we believe, violated the 27th Amendment, which says our salary can't be changed without an intervening election.
So she docked your pay, what, $500?
My wife says my pay's been docked $500. I've never seen my paycheck. The next fine would be $2,500.
Oh, so it's a progressive fine.
Yes, it's progressive. It goes up. But I've found that if I walk in discreetly, vote quickly, and then leave the chamber, they don't have time to serve me notice. And so that's the strategy I'll be adopting. I hope the Sergeant at Arms isn't watching the show.
Well, maybe it comes on after the fact that you've gotten away with it. Let's talk about COVID a little bit more. We know that you had the infection in 2020, and you've been really stern about the belief that you have as much immunity and protection from COVID as someone who has been vaccinated. And that's a big debate. Can you back that up with scientific research that shows and proves that that is indeed the case? And are you discouraging people to become vaccinated by your position?
I say I'm not promoting vaccine hesitancy. I'm promoting vaccine mandate hesitancy. In other words, I don't think there should be a mandate. I don't think anybody should be mandated to take the vaccine. In fact, I've introduced a bill that now has 31 co-sponsors that would keep the military from forcing its members to take the vaccine. And one of the reasons I'm so strongly promoting that bill is most of these vaccine mandates don't even recognize natural immunity as legitimate immunity. With the recent Delta variant, I actually believe that natural immunity is stronger, and there's evidence building for that. Let me be clear, I'm not advising anybody to go out and get COVID or seek to get COVID instead of the vaccine. If you're in an older age category and at high risk for this virus, it might be a good idea to get the vaccine. It may reduce your symptoms. But if you've already had, and I'll just speak for myself instead of giving medical advice, I've already had COVID. The Pfizer trial data, the Moderna trial data, the Cleveland Clinic study, which had 50,000 plus participants in it, and the Israel study, which had over 1 million participants in it, none of them demonstrated an advantage of taking the vaccine if you've already had COVID. And so I won't be taking it. I don't think anybody should be mandated to take it. And I especially believe if you've already had COVID, that should be recognized as a form of immunity that's just as legitimate as the vaccine.
But are there not cases where we call them breakthrough infections when it comes to those who are vaccinated? But there are people who have been reinfected with COVID after having had it once and perhaps even 2 times. So many people are concerned that the message that you're sending is somewhat perilous and dangerous to the overall, not just to your constituents, but to others who watch you on lots of national cable news networks. Your response?
Well, I'm promoting freedom, and there are rare cases, breakthrough cases, if you will, of people who've had prior infection and developed immunity from that, of them getting reinfected. Some of those cases are actually long COVID. They would have to go in and do an RNA analysis of the virus to know that it was 2 different strains, to know that you'd actually been reinfected instead of carrying the infection for a long time. But what we're seeing and what we saw in Israel is the breakthrough cases are far more likely to occur in the vaccinated group than the prior immunity group.
Have you had an antibody test, and do you still test high and with potent antibodies even after all of this time?
I had an antibody test in July of last year, which tested high. I've had a subsequent antibody test that didn't test positive. It was negative. That was in November. Subsequent to that, I've quarantined with somebody who had COVID in my house. I don't want to say which of my kids, but didn't catch it, even though there was no sign that I had antibodies in the antibody test, because as the studies have shown, that was just for a test for a specific type of antibody. And there are other antibodies, and there's T cell and B cell immunity, which are longer lived than the IgG antibodies.
Do you fear at all of contracting the Delta variant, which is a lot more potent than the original SARS?
I got a cold 2 weekends ago, and it felt a lot like the first bout of COVID. So I took a home test, and then I went to a hospital and took a drive-through lab test where they walk out in the moon suit and swab you. And then I took another home test, and then I've subsequently taken another home test. They've all come back negative. And I knew there would be a news story. I just wanted to know it was going to be that if it had happened or not. But I think it's possible. Like, I'm not ruling that out. I do believe if I
And have you ruled out getting a vaccine?
I will not consider getting the vaccine until I see evidence that it improves on the natural immunity that have already been conveyed. Which means and just to translate, I haven't seen that evidence, and so I'm not compelled to get a vaccine now. But I'm not telling people to not take the vaccine. I'm telling people to talk to your doctor. Don't listen to a politician. Don't listen to a public health expert. I had a sort of tangle with the CDC early on. I found a mistake on their website, promptly called the director in Washington, D.C. She got their top scientists on the line. They acknowledged that what they had printed was incorrect. By the way, they were characterizing the Pfizer trial data to say that if you had prior infection, that the vaccine would still be 92% efficacious, which was not true. They conceded that. They said they would change the website, and a month later they hadn't, and they never corrected it. They changed it, but they didn't correct it. And fortunately, I recorded every single phone call. So if anybody wants to go through the archives and see what really happened, I can show you. What I came to realize is I don't believe there's malintent at the CDC. I don't believe there's a conspiracy or a profit motive at the CDC. I believe that they don't trust individuals to know whether they've had COVID or not. And so they believe as public health policy that their general advice should be everybody should get the vaccine. But I think in their heart of hearts, they know, and there's enough science to show that if somebody's sophisticated enough to go get an antibody test and find out that they've had COVID, that the vaccine doesn't really benefit them. Right. That may change. That may change.
I do want to go back to talking about the mandatory COVID vaccinations for the military. We know that the military is moving forward that. I think September 15th is the date that policy would be effective. Defense Secretary Lord Austin said this requirement is critical to what he called maintaining military readiness. We've also heard the former Secretary of the Navy, Sean O'Keefe, who strongly supports the vaccine mandate, says that this actually can work as a matter of national security, given that troops travel all over the world. They're in tight spaces. So given the conditions that troops are often in and the locations they're often in, why would you be against their protection if it comes down to a matter of national security?
I think they're employing political science and not science because they too refuse to acknowledge prior infection. You could do a titer. You could find. It doesn't make sense to have young males who, by the way, it's a low risk of myocarditis, but it may be as high as 1 in 5,000 have this adverse side effect if you're between 18 and 24 years old and you're a male. That's a predominant demographic of our military. And I just don't think they're going about it scientifically. Regardless of what I say, here's what's going to happen. And I know this because I'm the sponsor of this bill. I have members of the military calling me up, asking me what to do. There are a lot of people who are going to leave the military. If they're officers, they're going to resign commissions, forego health care benefits and pensions that they have earned. It's really sad that they're being forced to make this decision. There are even enlisted members who are willing to be court-martialed or take less than an honorable discharge because they feel so passionately about not taking the vaccine. Theirs may be religious reasons or scientific reasons, but that's why I'm sponsoring this bill. And I think even if this bill doesn't pass, and it's not likely to, having 30 members of Congress who are on a written document says this should not go forward is a good statement, and hopefully it's giving the Secretary of Defense pause for thought.
The Department of Defense already requires 17 vaccinations, correct, under varying conditions for service members, and that's based on where they're going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So why is the COVID vaccine any different? You've been out of this country, traveled internationally, where you've had to get a series of vaccinations in order to leave and re-enter this country. Have you not?
I am, by the way, I am vaccine choice, not anti-vax. I took my booster shots before I went to India 3 years ago. That was the tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, and I even took a hepatitis shot. I chose not to take the flu shot. I'm like, is the flu bad in India? Why would I take the flu shot? They're like, oh, we think you could use it while you're here. I declined that. But I think people should have a choice in taking those shots. That's just, I think, a basic human right. Now, in the military, it is true that you can be compelled to break your leg, to break your back, to run in front of gunfire, right? A vaccine's probably not the riskiest thing you signed up to do when you joined the military, and you did do it knowing that in boot camp, you're going to be shot full of all sorts of vaccines. But if you look back to our history of the last vaccine that was mandated in the military, it was the Anthrax Vaccine, and Rumsfeld lost a lawsuit on that, where they were trying to compel everybody in the military to take it. And they had a lot of people who left, trained pilots, special forces, people who left the military over the anthrax vaccine requirement. And I just don't think it's a good history to repeat. If there's something that's safe and efficacious and it has a long history, and when you signed up in the military, you knew you were going to take it, fine. But for something that's still being borne out, very novel, I don't think it should be forced on our members of the military.
I want to get to an issue that's closer to home. I did want to ask you about the January 6th congressional medals vote in Afghanistan, but we'll have to reserve that for another conversation. Food supply, and you mentioned this early on in our interview, and meat supplier issues. So a lot of inflation in this industry, 14%, over 14%, I think. Beef is up 12%, pork is up 39%, chicken is up 16%. You're a cattle farmer.
Yeah.
How concerned are you about this, and what should be done to get these prices in check? And are they exacerbated by the pandemic, or are they artificially inflated as an excuse to use the pandemic in order to get to that level of pricing?
Well, it's not just inflation, and I'll tell you why I know that, because farmers are seeing the prices they get for the livestock go down, not up, and the price in the supermarket's going up. The spread is growing, and that's troubling a lot of us in this country. 4 meat packers control 85% of the meat that's slaughtered in the United States. They sit between the farmer and the consumer. One is wholly owned by China, one is wholly owned by Brazil, and the rest are multinational or big corporations. It's hard for somebody here in Carroll County who raises cattle to sell directly to consumer. We are fortunate enough to have a couple USDA facilities, USDA certified facilities in Kentucky who will do that. But they're backed up for over a year. And farmers, animals don't wait. Like, they get old and there's no nursing home for animals. And so what I've done is introduce a bill called the Prime Act to try and deal with the problem in the brittleness of the food supply. During COVID, we actually saw farmers who had to euthanize animals because they couldn't get them processed. The Prime Act would allow a farmer to use a local processor who's inspected by the health department and occasionally inspected by the USDA, but not always having a USDA staffer there, to use that local processor to sell to local consumers as long as they don't leave the state with that commerce. This bill, I've doubled the number of co-sponsors since COVID exposed the brittleness of our food supply chain. I just had another co-sponsor sign up today for the Prime Act. And so I think there's a good chance of getting a bill like this passed as an amendment to a farm bill, for instance.
Right. We'll keep our eyes on it, and we really appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us before you drive off to Washington, because we know you're going to do that in your electric car. We wish you safe travels, and thank you so much, Congressman Thomas Massie.
Thanks, Renee, and congratulations on your Emmy.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate that.